So I'm going to be doing a little bit about using Primm in the primary classroom. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit different, possibly to what some people are used to in terms of the programming lessons, but also it's not very, it's inspired by Primm, I suppose is probably the best way to think about it. But I'll go through it, and obviously we'll, if you've got any questions as we go, just sort of ask. But just a quick bit about me. Obviously, you can follow me on Twitter at Mr. MICT. I've been a teacher for 4 years now, but I've been working in education for about 8, nearly 10 years, just doing various things. I currently teach in year 6, and obviously I lead a CAS community in Newcastle as well, and I've offered sort of various CBD and resources across Newcastle and the Northeast for students, teachers, quite a few different things. So that's just a tiny bit about me, but I'll move on. So in terms of what you might get out of the session today, or what you hopefully would get out of the session, it's just a brief look at using Primm in the primary classroom and how it applies to programming lessons specifically. Obviously, it's a research-based practice, and there's still research going on, and I'll touch on that a little bit. And then hopefully it sort of gives you a flavor or an idea of what Primm might look like, whether plugged or unplugged. So just kick it off. I'm not going to read from this because I hate when people just read from slides, but I'll just give you a little bit about why I started using Primm. And obviously you can read this slide at your leisure. Obviously it was developed by Dr. Sue Sentence at the Raspberry Pi Foundation, and I first seen it last year at the CAS Northeast Regional Conference. And for me, it just sort of opened my eyes in terms of how we would teach programming in schools. It was Sue was sort of introducing it then for secondary schools, and I know there's more research going on now in terms of primary. And I think a lot of people, sort of Phil Bagg and a couple other people, sort of picked that up along the way. But it just really got me thinking about just this idea that if we're teaching children how to program, surely we should teach them how to read. And it's that idea of reading code first, because programming is a language. Obviously, you've got Java, C++, tons of different languages. And obviously, we're supposed to teach children how to interpret those languages. So it's kind of like teaching them how to speak French by just giving them a French dictionary and expecting them to decipher the sentences. So it doesn't quite work like that. I teach it sort of, I have taught it across Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, so obviously to varying degrees of success, but obviously it's based around the use, modify, create model. So obviously you would produce something that already has been produced to the kids and obviously give them that example, and then together you would modify it in the hope that they'd be able to create their own version of what you've shown them. And then obviously you would test it, analyze and refine it sort of in that DT design sort of circle that we would normally work through. So it's kind of inspired by that. Obviously, like I said, I'm not necessarily a major expert in Primm. I'm just a huge fan of how it can be used in schools. So I'll not go through all the nitty gritty. I'll just show you the process that we would go through. So obviously the first process for me in our school is always to start with the concept first. So obviously if you're teaching variables or if you're teaching repetition, then you would very much look at that concept. For me, I would always look at it in an unplugged setting, how it would relate to real life and a few other areas like that. But in our school, I've based our entire computing curriculum around the Barefoot's computational thinking poster. And obviously the sort of computational thinking ideas and obviously those approaches really helped sort of progress our skills in school. So like I said, I would always start with unplugged. It's just because it gives you a sort of opportunity to not just to expand the lessons, but to really get to grips with the programming before you just go straight to the computer or the iPad. And I've always found that, you know, when I was a student, a lot of the programming I witnessed was, we've got discovery coding, which I'm not disparaging at all, but you know, the kids were just plugged in with headphones and you know, they were going through the session, and it was often a good time for some admin as a teacher. And I just think that's the worst programming. You wouldn't do that with any other subject. So I just think you're sort of doing it a disservice. So I'll skip ahead. So we'll start with Key Stage 1, obviously thinking of progression. In our school, we use a couple of different apps, but primarily we use the FOOS CodeSpark Academy, which is absolutely fantastic. It's free for teachers, and obviously you can set up classrooms and give your kids individual logins, and it is gamified, but obviously it's got tons of new features now, and I can sort of give you a whistle stop tour in a second. And we use Scratch Junior as well to sort of bridge that year 2 to year 3, 4 gap. But I've used Scratch Junior all the way up to year 6, and the kids love it. So I would always start, like I said, with some sort of unplugged sort of idea. So it could be something like head, shoulders, knees, and toes, or it could be a dance. I've done sort of a training recently where I've done Baby Shark, and obviously instead of having the lyrics, I had sort of emojis and directions. And obviously the children had to interpret what the program was by obviously running the program. And then I've obviously threw a few bugs in there with a couple of different emojis just to throw them off. And that spanned 2 lessons. So obviously it really gets into the grips of the programming. But so Primm, the P stands for predict. So obviously the first thing you would do is obviously start with code for a program that already works. So there's tons of stuff you can find on Scratch. There's tons of projects on Scratch Junior if you're not totally up with it yourself that you can sort of download or use. What's really good about Scratch and Scratch Junior is you can print off these code cards that are on the screen. So obviously I've printed them off, and we've got a set, so I've got 5 per class, just because we would work in groups. And obviously the kids can then put the code together. So I would show them this on the screen. Obviously, depending on the levels of ability within your class, or if you've got any children who are SEND, then you can choose how you want to record it. So for example, in Key Stage 1, they've had a lot of success using storyboards. So just giving block storyboards, and the kids could draw what they think's going to happen based on the code. Now, admittedly, this is probably a little bit advanced, and obviously you're assuming that the children will have used Scratch Junior before already. So if you haven't and you're just going to go straight into this, I would make sure that the kids are very comfortable with the interface, what the blocks look like, a little bit before you can interpret. And obviously there is an element of teacher modeling in terms of questioning as well. But the kids could write out what will happen in steps. So obviously they can sort of quite easily work out based on this code that's on the screen. But obviously the circular arrow could mean a couple of different things. I've had kids tell me, oh, they're going to spin around, then they're going to move to the left or right, depending on how it is, and then they're going to draw a box too, or they're going to get their whiteboard out, as some of the things I've had. Another one was when we went onto the bottom line of code, I've had kids say, oh, they're going to get somebody and tickle them, and then they're going to sing a song, and then they're going to get down on their knees. So they can definitely interpret it in their own ways, and I think it's important to say that there's no wrong answer when you come to those kind of things. Or obviously if you've got something like Seesaw, or recording in the Book Creator or Chatterpix, obviously the kids can just verbally record what they think is going to happen if you want a little bit more independence. So that's kind of the prediction stage. For me, I've sort of laid it out in a couple of different lessons. So we would sort of predict and then run the code in the same lesson. So obviously what we would then do is, once you've sort of had your predictions, sort of experimented with the different ideas, asked a lot of your different questions, sort of teased out a couple of different ideas, then you can either get the children to put the code in, or if you've got iPads, you can airdrop the code out to them, and then they can just run it themselves. Or as a teacher, you can just run the code at the front of the class, either screen mirroring. There's also a Scratch Junior emulator that you can download for Mac and PC, and you can obviously use Scratch Junior as a Chromebook extension. So you can still use it on most devices to then show them. I've done it a couple of times because we use iPads, and if the screen mirroring doesn't work, I've just screen recorded what would happen, and then I can just use that as a video, and then it's all self-contained. But obviously there's a couple of different ways. So you would just run the program, see if their prediction was right, and obviously I'm sure you've been predicting while you've been sat there listening to me, and hopefully the video will play when I do this. There is a little bit of sound, but I'll explain it to you anyway. So that's me touching the character. Obviously it skipped a little there. Hello. And then obviously the microphone is me recording. Hello. So obviously it was really simple just to demonstrate the concept and the idea, but then you can spend quite a bit of time, looking at predictions, obviously whether your prediction is right, the skill of predicting well, and obviously it's making an educated guess. But then sort of the next stage is quite an interesting stage, which is the I stage, which is investigate. So obviously we've had predict, run, and then we've got the investigate. So yeah, I think just the investigation stage is quite a useful one in terms of coming up with questions, but also picking apart the programming and the different blocks and what the function is. And like I said, if you're thinking of digital literacy skills, you can ask what the input was. So obviously they're using a touchscreen interface, or you can sort of ask what happens if you change the number on the movement blocks. What if you choose a different input? So obviously at the minute, we'll have the green flag or touch character. You can have different interfaces in terms of sending messages and all that kind of stuff on Scratch Junior. And then obviously you can think of different ways it links to other subjects or other things in, concepts across school as well. So then after investigate is the stage when they can get a little bit more creative. So it's the modify stage. So that first M stands for modify. And obviously students, this is the chance for them to understand that they've already developed some understanding of code and now they can change different things. So here, obviously you've got your arrow blocks. So the children should, in that investigate stage, have identified that the arrows are about direction. It's quite a good point to make. When we've done this in key stage, in year 1, these down and up arrows, the children always think that they're going to hunch down or jump. So, it was really nice to talk about the debugging and obviously how that actually isn't the case, and it's moving across the screen and down the screen rather than jumping, because I think they always think of it in ideas of video games sometimes as well. So when they're modifying it, that's their opportunity to change the character, to change the program, to add more characters, and you can ask different things entirely. So you could link it to a topic that you're doing. We use Scratch Junior quite successfully in year 3 for instructional writing. So this year the year group have done instructions to make bread, and they've animated the sequence of what you would do by the children drawing in their bread. And before we did it with how to wash a woolly mammoth. So obviously, because the children have spent so much time getting to grips with the interface and predicting and obviously investigating the code, then they can really, it sort of eliminates a lot of the teacher support. I think a part of programming is teachers feel they can't support because they don't know what they're doing. So obviously it really helps structure things for the teacher as well as the child. And then the last, like I said, is the make. So once the children have modified, then obviously you can use the basis of what you've done to make their own program, and that can be linked to anything that you're doing in school, or it can just be completely independent, obviously depending on your programming lessons. But like I said, we've made animations about lots of different things, like the life cycle of a flowering plant, where the kids animated seeds that shot out stems and then became a flower and then had a little bee flying past. So there's tons of different things that you can do with it. Obviously I have some of those examples, I just didn't get a chance to put them in the slide. So if we can forward them off later, then I'm happy to do that, just to give you an idea of what it would look like. So I suppose it might be a good time just to see if anybody does have any questions before we move on to key stage 2. Obviously the process isn't any different, but just if there are any, it might be a good time to pause there.
I've got a question here. Do you have a link to the emulators?
Yes, I'll just see if I can pull it up. Wasn't that one? I will find it, and then we could possibly put that in the chat at the end. Just it was in there. I'll just pause my screen for a second.
Okay.
Yeah. So obviously the link is a bit of a long one. We can pop that in the chat. Just double check that that's definitely worked. So obviously there's the Mac, the Windows, and then if you just Google it on Chrome, if you've got Chromebooks, obviously you can get it there as well. So I'll go on to Key Stage 2. Again, the principle's not changed. It can just be a little bit more complicated. So we use Scratch and a couple of different apps in Key Stage 2, but Scratch is, it's just incredibly versatile, so there's no real reason to download. My personal opinion is there's no point in paying for something if you've got an incredible free resource out there. And I think now that it works on iPads, there's no excuse really. So the link to these Scratch blocks are in that previous slide, and I think the slides, could probably email those out, I think afterwards, so you can have those links. But they can be edited as well, and obviously you can write on them, but it's exactly the same idea. So you would predict what the code's going to do, and obviously the children would need a certain level, so I delivered this level at year 5, this lesson, and obviously there's a lot more for the children to decipher. So what you can do, and what I've done in the past, is I've snipped the code, and then I've put it on sort of a worksheet, and obviously you can either put it on a worksheet or you can put it on just a big A3 sheet of paper, and the kids can literally just with arrows draw what they think this code will do, what they think each block will do. Obviously you can make links to what they're already learning, so you can sort of tease questions out by going, well, the X and the Y, where have we seen that before? Sort of the -20, that looks quite familiar. And especially in year 5, when we were sort of looking at quadrants, sort of coordinates across 4 quadrants, it was quite easy to make that link and reinforce it. Obviously you can do the same thing. So we've got the number 90 here, and it's saying point in a direction. Obviously if you're looking at angles and things, and then the percentages as well. So I think with Scratch, there's tons of ways that you could spend a huge amount of time just predicting, and this could be a whole lesson entirely, rather than doing the run in the same lesson. And I suppose you've got that idea if you can save some for later. But again, you can do the storyboard if you wanted to. So you could show the children the code on the Scratch interface, and obviously you've got the character. So this has just the Scratch cat on the interface. So you could just ask them, what do you think this code is going to make the character do? And just sort of look at the code. Obviously in our school, we would have taught repetition in year 4, so it would be quite good to refer back to that if this was the first thing we were doing. So there's tons again of ways that you can sort of tease that out using that prediction model, and I think it's quite nice if you link that with science, because we do a lot of obviously prediction in science. Then you would move on to the R again. So once you've spent and exhausted all your time predicting what the code will do, and obviously bear in mind this would have been quite far in a sequence if you think of the concept and the programming unplugged that we would have done, the kids get the chance to see if their prediction was right. So obviously looking at that code, we would sort of identify a couple of different predictions, and then you would just run the code for the children. So again, I've just done a little bit of a screen record, and you can have a quick look and see if your prediction was right. So obviously pause it there. But obviously the children will have identified some sort of run-in and set in size to 300, and then obviously the change in size -5 each time. Obviously it's change in size, and that's going to happen forever until it literally disappears. And obviously if on edge, it's going to bounce to the other edge. So there's definite things that the children have picked out when I've taught this. The investigate, again, it's a really interesting phase because, like the prediction, you can come back to the predictions and investigate the blocks bit by bit, code by code. So they get to look at the details, they get to look at the program line by line. So you can ask what type of loop is being used. Obviously, the children would have done repetition. You can look at, forever loops, while loops, all the different forms of loops. What happens if you were to change the rotation style? So obviously instead of left to right, obviously they would assume you would have up and down, so the character is going to run up and down the screen. And then the children sort of do what will happen if you change 5 to move 500. And what if you change the size to a positive number? So there's tons of different ways that you can investigate the code further. And I think that sort of playing in a structured way helps them identify what each block does. Because often I've done a code club and it's like, oh, I don't know what this block does. I don't know how to get them to do this. But then the second you bring a bit of structure into it like this, they've already identified one way that block works. So then the kind of using the process of elimination or sort of educated guesses can make the other, and that's them learning at the end of the day. What I've done normally is sent this code out again to the iPads, so it's already there for them, because I think the worst thing is going, right now it's your turn to modify it or it's your turn to run it, and giving them the opportunity to put the code in for me was a waste of time, because this isn't their code, this is the model code. So having to actually put the blocks in, because for me the focus wasn't on whether they can program this code, it was, can they use this code as a model for one of their own? So we'll sort of take that element of debugging out for a minute and then leave that to the make stage. So the modify, you can ask them questions like, can you change the sprite? Can you make the sprite look like he's coming from far away, then moving towards you? Can you change the animal? Could you make the movement like the animal? Obviously, there's tons of different things that you can do. So again, that can be an entire lesson on its own. And then the make is the bit the kids love. Obviously, it's their opportunity to show off and show what they can do. Again, just using that code as the model. So it means we would call them our slower graspers. Obviously, they have a model to work from, so you're not just expecting them to come up with something. And you've got kids who probably don't read that well. I've got children in my class who aren't reading at the same level as the other kids, and code is reading. So if you're giving them something to begin with, it sort of takes that element of fear away. Because yes, some kids are brilliant at programming when they're not brilliant at reading, but obviously some struggle. So I think for me it's a brilliant scaffold to use. In terms of how I use Primm across school, we sort of or suggest that it's used as a planning model. So in year 6, we linked our science lessons with using microbits, because we were building circuits. And we've got the wonderful circuit kit in the vault in the school that we use, and it's been there for a long time. But the children had already done circuits in year 4, so it was trying to think of a way that they can expand on what they've done. So we used microbits that we've got in school, and they're absolutely fantastic. They're a little bit fiddly when you've got iPads, but I think it's still worth it in my opinion. And the children built their own steady hand game, and I'll show you the slides that I've used to illustrate how the Primm would work in that example. We sort of stretched the last stages across a couple of different lessons, so we've just sort of planned it. In terms of our planning format, it's relatively simple. But we would then, I always insist at the end of any sort of programming unit or series of lessons that the children should absolutely reflect on what they've done, and would always sort of use the perfect computational thinkers poster, and that would be on pretty much the end of every one of my lessons, and we'll reflect on the approaches we've used. Obviously, the concept, we would already kind of have told them what they were using, but not always. And, you know, it's quite nice, some of the children's responses. And what we tend to do is get the children either to do that in their book, if it was the science lesson, or on Seesaw in a computing folder, they would take a picture of that and then reflect underneath it, or record themselves reflecting on the process, thinking about the concepts and approaches. And, you know, some of the stuff the children have come out with are really insightful. So that's kind of why I think it's a really good model. I mean, obviously it's not for everyone, but I certainly believe that Primm is definitely a fantastic way to teach programming. Obviously, if you think of comprehension in text, how incredibly important it is, I think it's exactly the same in code. Obviously, being able to read and understand it obviously increases the ability to do it and write code. And what's amazing is that's proven by this research. You know, it improves the outcomes. And I think if you're a lot of what happens in secondary schools, based on colleagues I've spoken to, is because the children have such a varied experience in primary. Some primary schools are doing amazing stuff, and other primary schools are doing very little. And that's not because they can't, it's just because of the confidence of the staff. Obviously, they're not sure where to start and all that kind of stuff. And that's where CAS and obviously the NCCE come in. Obviously, talking about the program means that they need to use the words that's in the program, and obviously they need to use the proper terminology. I had a discussion with a colleague a while ago about some of the words, you know, obviously using words like algorithms and decomposition and abstraction. And some of them were saying, well, you know, year 2 aren't going to be able to do that. They're not going to know what that word means. And somebody said, well, they know what multiplication means. They know what division means. So as long as they're using it and you're constantly being exposed to it and that's being modeled, I don't think there's any reason why we should shy away from the correct terminology. Obviously, you can move on to things like code reading, which there was a fantastic session this week on, and obviously it allows the beginner obviously to create their own model, where, you know, if I was drawing a picture, I would never just start from scratch. I would always look at an example, or you would start from tracing, and it's exactly the same process. It just makes it a bit more accessible. So I'll not go onto the summary just yet, but I'll just quickly show you some examples of things. So I'll show you the lesson in year 6 that we used. So we were looking at variables unplugged. So our first lesson was obviously just exploring that concept, because the children had done it in year 5, but they needed to be reminded. So obviously we would think of things that we would do the same way every single day. Obviously then I was, you know, refreshing them on an algorithm, because programming in our school has been a bit of a process. Obviously we're still developing how things are working. We would look at everyday algorithms. So obviously there's an amazing set of videos on BBC Bite Size. You just type in the concept that you're thinking of, so algorithm, BBC Bite Size, and there's just some just beautiful animations that just describe instantly what you want to say. But I would think of different things like getting up in the morning, having your breakfast, getting changed for PE, stuff that teachers do all the time. And then we got them on their whiteboards to write an algorithm, obviously to get me from the back of the room to open at the door. I think they love programming the teachers, so it's obviously a favorite for quite a few people. And then we looked at what a variable was, and it was quite an interesting conversation, because the children had already been, you know, exposed to that in science. So we were talking about what a variable was in science, and obviously the children were saying that that's the part we can change. So we moved on from that to obviously talk about real life variables. So obviously it's a storage pot for, you know, information that can change. So obviously there's the variable aspect. And I think showing them examples really opened it up, because I don't think they'd ever identified where a variable would be. So scoreboards, obviously, you know, the total on your cash register, numbers on screens and lifts, just little things like that really brought it to them at a more real level. And we went to the lift we had in school and looked at the numbers and looked at different variables we had around school as well. Then obviously this was a poetry jam slam that I pulled from, I think it's Apple's Everyone Can Code, and they've got a series of lessons with keynotes that you can download from iBooks. It's obviously completely free, and it's linked to Swift Playgrounds and Tinker, another programming app. And obviously, if you haven't seen them, just download them, because the resources are really good to edit and tweak, and it gives you some ideas of what you would do. So the activity was obviously the name and the animal, so they were the two variables, which meant obviously the children could change those parts of the poem, and then they got to perform them in class. But then when we were coming on to programming it, we were using the variables in this program. So these were our variables here. So the steady hand game using the microbits was programmed that every time the wire was touched, it would change the number of fields one by one. So obviously change fields by 1 is your variable, and then obviously if you're pressing A on the microbit, it set it back to the beginning. So I had screenshotted this, I put it on a worksheet, and it basically asked them these questions. What do you think the code will do line by line? Obviously discuss with your partner and write a short prediction. Now, because ours were in year 6, I thought it was important for them to write their prediction out, and using sort of terminology that they would use. And then obviously we'll run the code. So I sent them the code on microbit, and then they run it using the microbit in the circuit kit. And then obviously we can investigate it, and they can add different things. So they could add cheat codes, they could program different buttons, lots of different things that they could do. And we just use sort of this stem sentence for them. So I found that, and you can say I found that when I changed this, this happened, and it affected the program in this way, and it just sort of helped them reflect on the process as they went. But that's just a quick example of how I've used Primm in year 6. Obviously, I can dig out links for examples I've used in the past, for things like I did a lesson using the Edison robots. I don't know if anybody's seen those before, but they're wicked little robots that are Lego compatible as well. And planned a whole series for year 5 because they were doing directions and they were linking it to their American topic. So tons of things, obviously, and it is quite literally a whistle-stop tour of Primm. So like I said, I'm absolutely no expert. I'm not 2 sentence, but I absolutely think that it certainly gives a structure to programming lessons. And my plan as a computing lead is to embed this across every year group's project, so that each year group are approaching every programming lesson in the exact same way. And then hopefully by the time the children from reception get to year 6, their skills in programming will be next to none, and they can go off into secondary school and become incredible logical thinkers. They don't have to become computer scientists, but it certainly helps them develop a certain sense of thinking skills. I haven't fully updated this slide, but I just thought if you do want some further reading, there's some info here on fostering programming comprehension, and obviously there's some information from Sue Sentence on a blog there on that Primm in WordPress. So there is some great resources that Phil uses on his Codeit website that I've put the link there, and he's got obviously free planning, free lessons, free slides. They're all in PDF format, and he uses Primm in Scratch in Key Stage 2 to obviously structure quite a lot of lessons. So if you wanted to have a look at some of those, obviously you can have a look at that slide there and go to those websites. I've recently just set up my own site, obviously petabytes.com. It's still a work in progress, but the plan is to, for me to put any resources that I produce for school, for teaching and things on there, so they'll be free. You can access them, and obviously they'll be a blog, and I'll just, do what people do on websites. In terms of further CPT, I was going to put extra links in, but I thought obviously there's tons of stuff going on at CAS, in the next 5 days. There has been the last week. The NCCE are running amazing free courses at the minute on a wide variety of things, and Future Learn have got some incredible things going on too. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but literally Really, there's a million things going on at the minute, and if you do need any support or you're sort of trying Primm after this session, it'd be great if you sort of tweeted me some examples, because it'd be quite nice to see people trying. I know obviously schools are in a very different place than they were at the beginning of the year, so I understand that it might be a while, but if you're in with some key workers, or you're in with your year 6 or year 1 or whatever year group it is, you can obviously give it a go and send me a tweet. But follow me for more tips, more ideas. I'm planning on doing some extra CPD if you want a bit more of a, obviously this was very much a talk at you session, just given the circumstances, but obviously a more hands-on experience if you're in the Northeast would be great, and obviously I can plan that going forward. But I think just for now, obviously if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you very much, Carl. That was really, really good. I've got a couple of questions in the chat I'll share with you now. One here says, do you introduce a concept and then go through the Primm stages, or do you introduce a concept after the predict stage?
I would always introduce the concept first, just because again, it depends on the varying experience the kids have had throughout school. Obviously, every school has teachers that are very good teaching program, and other teachers not so much. So I would always introduce the concept first. So if it was algorithms, if that was my concept, obviously I would introduce real world ideas in terms of what algorithms were, and look at examples and play around with those before starting Primm. But that's not to say that you can't introduce the concept using Primm, I suppose, once you've gone through it a little bit. And then if you're looking at unplugged ideas, you could certainly look at sort of pseudo algorithms. So if you had an algorithm to brush your teeth, obviously if you had the simple instructions, and if you put them in the wrong order, you could get them to predict what would happen. So you're sort of drip feeding those little stages in, which is also quite nice. So, there's no set model, but it definitely gives you a structure, I think.
Yeah. And another question here about Scratch. In your experience, Carl, do you set up Scratch accounts for your pupils, or do you get them to create their own, or do you just use Scratch without accounts?
I suppose it depends on the school. So I've done it in the past just because leadership are fine with it, where you can let the kids use Scratch accounts that they've got from home, but obviously not every child will. So you can set up a Scratch teacher account. It's a little more fiddly than setting up a personal account, but the upside is you can create classrooms. So when you set up a Scratch teacher account, they just have to verify you're a teacher. They haven't called me and checked. I'm sure there has something going on behind the scenes, but when I signed up, I had to just put in my school's website, their telephone number and address. And I think if your staff list is on the website, maybe somebody behind the scenes checks it, but obviously I wasn't aware. But then I just set up a generic classroom for the kids, and I just give them, generic names. I think the thing with Scratch is because the names are automatically generated anyway. When you do that, it just means you've got a class that you can reuse each year, because you're not actually giving the kids individual accounts. It's probably the best way to do it, because then their work's saved. Because if you're using Scratch specifically on, I think, Chromebooks or iPads, often it'll refresh automatically when you've got like auto refresh on, when it's frozen, and that deletes everything they've done before. So your less resilient children really kick off when that happens. So if they've got a Scratch account, it automatically saves, but like a Google document. So I would definitely set up an account and give them logins, especially if you want them to save. If you're just messing around with it and you're not really bothered, then obviously I would just set that expectation at the beginning.
Yeah, I've found with children that I've done Scratch with in the past that you will always get some in the group who've got an account.
Yeah,
you can set up accounts obviously for them as well. What we did at my school was we said, right, great, that's your personal account, you do whatever you like with that account, that's yours. This is going to be your school account, just so that we could keep the sort of school stuff separate from their personal stuff. Unfortunately, there isn't a way to link accounts that they've created to a school,
yeah,
which may come along later. I mean, Scratch was quite late to the whole teacher account thing, it was only introduced a couple of years ago now, I think, and it's still quite limited, but it is an option if you'd like to create accounts for your class and sort of keep it in a way that you can easily access their accounts. And it's also useful for resetting passwords. That is an option. I've dropped a link in the chat for the FAQ from the Scratch website about how to do that. I've also in the chat, I've put a link to the magazine that you quoted at the beginning with the Primm article, which people might find interesting as well. To read Sue Sentence's article on that as it goes into Primm in more detail. But thank you, Carl. Lots of people in the chat saying they're very happy with it's a great presentation, very clear, very concise, lots of things to try, and a couple of requests for the slides. So I'll email you afterwards, Carl, and we'll sort out sharing the slides if you're happy to.
Yeah, that's fine. And like I said, I'll share some different, I'll dig out the examples and I can pop them in as well. Just it gives you a bit more illustration of different activities we've done with Scratch and Scratch Junior, because there's some wicked things the kids have come out with. And I think sometimes it's seeing what people can do. Because sometimes I think, you know, teachers just end up animating the cat, and I think Scratch is incredibly versatile. So yeah, happy to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carl.